Bobby Fischer shows us a perfect understanding of chess structures in this masterpiece, played against Julio Bolbocan, a grandmaster from Argentina. This game was in 1962 at the Interzonal in Stockholm, and you just can't help but learn from this game. Anyone who goes over this game will be stronger for having done so. Let us jump right in. Fischer has white, Grandmaster Bolbocan has black. Fischer begins, of course, with e4, best by test, and the Sicilian is the response. Knight f3, d6, d4, cd4, knight d4, knight f6, knight c3, and a6, the Najdorf Sicilian. And here Fischer plays a move that was a pretty rare guest back then. It's quite common today, though, sort of a pioneering idea, h3. And the basic concept for white here is similar to the Kara's attack, where you just want to play g4 and g5, gain space, and dislodge this knight on f6. Knight c6 is played, and he continues with his plan of g4. The main move for black, and the best scoring move anyway, is queen to b6. I'm not sure why. It does score well for black, but after knight b3, e6, bishop e3, hitting the queen, it looks like white has a decent position. But Grandmaster Bolbocan instead takes the knight on d4. Fischer takes with the queen, and this is a well-placed queen. You know, they say don't develop your queen too early, but in certain situations, the queen can be well-placed early. And in this case, the queen is well-placed because there's no knight to kick it out anymore, so it can sort of stay there. But that probably prompts Grandmaster Bolbocan's next move. He plays e5, hitting the queen, so he does gain a tempo against it. The problem is he creates some weaknesses when he makes this move. Fischer moves the queen back, and you'll see now we have what is known as the Boleslavsky pawn structure, very common in Sicilians, where basically there's a big fight over this d5 square. Black wants to be able to advance d6, d5, and liquidate that weakness. White wants to fix it in place and get a piece permanently placed on that d5 square. So that's part of the battle here. Black probably should respond with h6 here to slow down this g5 idea, but instead Grandmaster Bolbocan plays a bishop to e7, and that lets Fischer do what he wants to do. He plays g5, and he kicks away the one piece that has some control over the d5 square. That's a key idea. The knight goes to d7. It can hop into c5, or it puts some pressure on e4, hits the queen. Fischer plays bishop to e3. Now, the idea is not to take the knight when it lands on c5, but he wants to move the queen back to d2 without blocking in that bishop. Knight to c5. You see, if he were to take this knight, he'd give up. Black would get the bishop pair, and he'd sort of fix this structural damage a little bit. So he doesn't want to do that. So he plays queen to d2, bishop to e6, well placed, controlling d5. And now Fischer castles long, and any hope black might have had of playing d5 and liquidating that weakness is pretty much gone. The pawn, the knight, the queen, and the rook all control d5, and there's just no way black is going to be able to play that move himself. He goes ahead and castles short. f3, Fischer defends e4, so now his knight on c3 is free to move. It was the only piece defending e4. Rook to c8, placing the rook opposite the king. King to b1, very standard when you castle queenside to play that king to b1. Now here, Bolbocan plays the move knight to d7, with the idea of rerouting the knight to c4, to go knight b6, c4. The problem is that knight has made quite a few moves, and giving a player like Fischer tempos like that rarely works out well. Perhaps a better idea was f6, trying to gain some counterplay by opening up the f-file, putting some pressure on f3. That was a possibility. Knight to d7, though, is played. Fischer says, okay, you give me a tempo for my attack, I'm going to take that tempo. And he advances the h-pawn to h4, b5, and now a very instructional move, bishop to h3. Black's light-squared bishop is one of his better pieces, maybe his best minor piece. So Fischer offers to trade it off. His own light-squared bishop wasn't that good. And Bolbocan probably should have let Fischer take on e6. At the very least, he could recapture with the pawn and control d5 a little bit. But he goes ahead and takes the bishop himself. Rook takes h3, knight to b6. Now, black wants to play knight to c4 and create some problems around white's king. So before that happens, Fischer just goes ahead and chops it off, and queen takes b6. But notice, Fischer has gotten exactly what he wants. We talked about the weakness of this d5 square, how important it is in this structure. Well, the ideal minor piece arrangement for white is a knight on d5 against a dark squared bishop, because a dark squared bishop can never challenge the knight. The bishop is imprisoned on the dark squares. It can never directly attack a light square. So a knight on d5 against this bishop is a beautiful arrangement for white. And Fischer has created this scenario, and now he has a dominant minor piece, a very key to his strategy. He's hitting the queen, of course. The queen moves back to d8. Now here Fischer plays f4. Black does not want to allow Fischer to play f5 and get these pawns rolling against the king. So he takes on f4, queen takes f4, and now Fischer's queen is in a much more aggressive position. He has a half-open f-file he can use to attack. Queen to d7 from black, and here a sneaky move from Fischer, queen to f5. It would be a blunder, of course, for black to take that queen, because Fischer would not take with the pawn, but would instead play knight takes bishop check, forking the king and the queen, and he actually wins an entire minor piece. He wins the bishop. So queen f5 is not happening. So rook c to d8 to defend the queen. And here, if Fischer were to take the queen, maybe black can fight and draw this position. So instead, Fischer plays rook to a3. Very hard to deal with his pressure against this pawn. If the rook moves, he'd lose the queen. If the queen moves, then he's got to worry about the threat against this bishop. He does play queen a7, and Fischer could take the bishop with check, queen takes, and then take the pawn at a6. He'd be up a pawn. He would be better, but he doesn't want to give up that beautiful knight simply for a pawn, so he does not do that here. He instead plays rook to c3, with the threat of rook to c7 double attacking the queen and the bishop. So if rook to d7, to stop that threat, Fischer would have this beautiful shot. Knight to f6 check, not only forking the king and the rook, but if the king were to move, he would just play queen h7 mate. Basically, it would force the capture of the knight. And after pawn takes, there's no easy response here. If he takes with the bishop, then rook to g3 check, bishop g7, queen to f6, and eventual mate is unstoppable on g7. We see that bishop is pinned, so it can't take the queen. It's just going to be captured. And if the bishop retreats to d8, just queen g5 check, forcing the king over, and then queen g7 checkmate. So because of that, Grandmaster Bolbakhan plays g6, kicking the queen away. Now, it does weaken the dark squares a bit, there's no doubt, but he has to do something. That queen is just ominous sitting on f5. The queen goes to g4. Here it can help support h4, h5. Queen to d7, offering the exchange of queens, which Fischer does not want. Queen to f3, and now queen to e6. So slowly but surely, black is getting his queen into a little better position, and he'd like to play f6 and maybe get some counterplay down the f-file. But now rook to c7. Fischer is attacking that bishop. The bishop has to be defended, of course. Rook d to e8, and now knight to f4. And notice this queen has very few squares available to it, really only one square where it's not going to be captured, and that's queen to e5. Now rook to d5, and again, the queen has very few squares, really only g7 and h8. Grandmaster Bolbakhan chooses h8 so he can support advancing the h-pawn and try to get some freedom over here. a3, Fischer knows he has a beautiful bind, so he just gives his king a little luft, so there are no potential back rank problems in future variations. h6 from black, Fischer takes, queen takes, and h5. Putting direct pressure on h6, trying to open up as many lines against black's king as possible. If black plays g5, and then after knight to h3, Fischer just has too many threats. Pressure against g5 after queen to g4, rook a7 going after the a6 pawn. It would just be too much. The position would collapse. g5 is too weakening. So instead, black plays bishop to g5, attacking the knight twice. Fischer ignores that and goes ahead and takes on g6. Now, if black were to take the knight here, then pawn takes check, rook takes, king takes, and rook to f5 check, winning back the piece. He's up a pawn, and black's king is way too exposed to survive this position. So instead of that, black goes ahead and takes on g6. And now this knight looks like it's in some trouble. It's attacked 3 times and is pinned. But Fischer knew all of this and prepared this next shot. Queen to b3. Says, you can have that knight. I'm going after your king. And right now, of course, he's threatening a discovery. Any move by this rook would be check. So that's a very powerful situation. And if he were to try to move the king away, then Fischer could do something along these lines, say knight to g6 check, when the queen takes, rook takes, and if he retakes, queen to h3 check, queen to h7 checkmate. So that would happen if he just tried to move the king away. So instead, Grandmaster Bulbacon says, I'm going to take that knight, and if it's possible to survive, we'll see. Fischer's next move, beautiful. Rook to e5, discovered check, and attacking this rook on e8. So black plays king to f8 to defend that rook, but now rook takes rook check, and here black resigned. Fischer wins, and here is why. After he takes the rook, which is obviously forced, Fischer will play queen to e6 check. And no matter what he does, he loses. If he plays king to f8, queen to c8 leads to mate. He could just block it once, and that would be mate. Otherwise, Fischer would just obviously mate this way. A really beautiful game, and that difference between that knight and that bishop and that understanding of how that structure is handled is really, really instructional. I hope you've enjoyed the game. See you again soon at Chess Dog. Goodbye.